So last time we did go over a few of these slides. I just want to reiterate them because they are important archaeologically. Well, okay, all right, perfect. So we got Khirbet Qeiyafa here we talked about. This is a Israelite fortress that's about 20 miles from Jerusalem overlooking the Elah Valley. That valley is where David and Goliath had their confrontation. Key feature is it has two gates. You can see one here and the other one here. Aerial view and down on the ground. What is interesting about it is one, it has a double wall. You can see here one wall, two walls, and then the gate. And this is also found in other Israelite cities and fortresses. But what is most unique is that it only has a single layer as far as settlement here. So we can use it to then date other settlements that have multiple layers, but layers that have these features in it mean it came from the same time period as Khirbet Qeiyafa. We know it's Jewish settlements because it is basically has no pig bones in there, but they didn't eat pig, just like the Jews. We have Jewish writing here in this ostracon. We have the name Ishbaal, which we know is a Jewish name. We also have Jewish pottery, no sign of pagan or idol worship, and carbon dating shows that it occurred at the time period of David's life, but the rule of Saul and a little bit of David's rule. Oh, a little delayed, all right. Most likely it is connected to Shara'arayim. Again, not great at Hebrew, but basically it's two gates. Some biblical translations will have the Hebrew word, some will have two gates. But basically, it would be right here. That's Khirbet Qeiyafa. And in the Bible, we see that this name is mentioned with a number of other cities that are also in this area. So it's very likely that this is, biblically, two gates. But we don't know that for sure. Either way, it doesn't really matter if it was a city listed in the biblical text. What matters is that everything is pointing to it being a city archaeologically that existed underneath Saul and David's rule at their time. We can then use that to date a number of other cities as being underneath the same time period and underneath the same rule. That's because architecture is a very key thing when you're trying to figure out when something was built and when something was in use. You drive down the road, you see an abandoned Pizza Hut, you know it's an abandoned Pizza Hut, and you know when it was built because of the iconic Pizza Hut roof. It was built a few decades ago. Doesn't matter if it's now a CVS or whatever, if it has that roof, you know it was a Pizza Hut just a few decades ago. So we take this city here, Khirbet Qeiyafa, and we can see the same architecture in a number of other cities. Beth Shemesh, Tel El Nashba, Khirbet Ed Dawara. These are the names today. And that's because they use this here. That casemate system. So you got the gate here, you got this parallel four-chambered gate. So they'd come into the city or the fortress, you would then have all these rooms here. Now, what is very interesting about this is usually you don't want a narrow wall. You don't want a small wall, because a small wall means it's easy to break through and it can't be that high. But the ingenious part about making a double thin wall is that you can then get a higher wall, but then you can also get a thicker wall in times of distress. So in times of peace, these spots here would be used for storage. Everybody who has a home or an apartment loves storage because you don't have enough of it. Same for these cities here. So when they were not at war, they would put all their junk in here. Now, during times of conflict, though, they would remove all their junk that they wanted and put in literal junk as far as dirt, debris, and rubble. By doing that, they would make this two narrow walls be one thick wall. So instead of one little wall here, you have one thick wall encompassing both of them, basically combining the two. This would make their defense very, very secure. And it may be what Isaiah 22:10 is referring when it says, "You counted the houses of Jerusalem and tore them down to strengthen the wall." This might be what they were doing, tearing down their stuff to fill these spaces. But this is one thing that is notable about David's cities, cities that were built up about this time. Except for the city of Ziklag. This is because it is David's first city. the first place that he had control over. And it was not an Israelite city, in fact. This city is mentioned 15 times in the Bible. Around the 12th and 11th century, we see that it has Philistine pottery. It is a Philistine city. We see foundation offerings. This is what the Philistines would do when they wanted good luck on a building. They would put something, an offering, in the foundation and build the building. We see massive stone structures, basically things that are looking very similar to Gath, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Ashdod, major other Philistine cities. And then there's a smooth transition, no destruction layer, but suddenly we start seeing evidence of rural Judean culture. About the early 10th century BC, we see hundreds of complete vessels identical to Kirbet Kiafa, and then we see an intense fire destroying everything. All this parallels what we know of this city biblically. David is given this city by the King Achish of Gath in 1 Samuel 27. David lives there for a bit over a year. He is supposedly working for the Philistines, though not in reality. And then when he is called to serve them when they fight Saul, just before Saul's death, he goes, but then the other rulers send him away because they don't trust him. Rightly so in this case. But when he gets back to his city, he finds it destroyed. The Amalekites came in and raided. They took off all their people and destroyed the city. All this is what we find identical with the biblical narrative. So even though we don't have those telltale Israelite architectural finds, we still know that this is the Ziklag of the Bible because it runs parallel to the biblical account. Other cities, though, that were Israelite cities, we have Tel Etan or Tel Etan. We see a large residential building here called Building 101. It's a variation of the four-room house, but it's huge. Huge for this time period means 2,500 square foot ground floor. We also have the ashlar stones that are popping up about this time. Those are the stones that have Phoenician influences in them. We also have Beth Shemesh, casemate walls. We have Tel in Nashba, another casemate wall, and Kerber El Ed Dawara. Now, what is interesting about this site is it's not in a good place. This is an arid climate. This is not some place you want to settle. This is mainly a strategic outpost, a place where it's defensive, not necessarily for itself, but for other settlements. Meaning that whoever built this and lived here was defending other places, meaning that it was a large state, not just a city-state, but a large state with multiple settlements. And furthermore, to that line of thought, we have numerous Edomite fortresses. You can see here a number of their designs as far as their foundational structures. In 2 Samuel 8:14, it says, "And he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom put he garrisons, and all the Edomites became servants of David." Edom is a very strategic place for trade routes. It's not necessarily a nice place to live, though. A very arid, harsh environment. But you had to go through there to get to other places. There were also a number of copper mines, which we'll get into here in a bit. But there are a number of sites. All these sites lack a burial or cultic remains, meaning they didn't bury their dead here, and they didn't have any pagan or idol things there. They had nothing as far as religious what's the word I want to use? Items. That's a fine word there, I guess. But we got no oil lamps, no other ubiquitous finds expected for a settlement. So we're not seeing all the things that you'd expect to find if people lived here, if they lived and worked here. We see that there are people here because we see large storage vessels with everything that we need, or they would need for food and water. So people were working here, but not living here. These were basically far-out outposts. We see wheel-made pottery, and what is interesting are these things, these fortresses, are in Edom, but we see Judean pottery. So we don't know who exactly was manning these garrisons. Was it Edom, since they were the servants of David, or was it Israelites working here in the land of Edom? We don't know. But there are quite a few of them. You can see on the map here, all of those black dots are these fortresses. Throughout all the land of Edom put he fortresses, and it looks like that. And these are just the ones we found. We have found at least 60 towers dotting along roads. some large, some small, all extending down to the Red Sea coast, all coming from the same time period, meaning that these were all built not over centuries, but over decades. You can see some of the remnants of some of them here. But these were massive, at least as far as their span of covering area, massive. Each fortress, though, was relatively small, meaning that these were basically ways to put people along trade routes to make sure trade was happening peacefully. Because a lot of this area here in Edom was not hospitable and perfect for people to come in and raid and get wealthy off of these massive trade routes. And as far as David's time goes, that's when we really start to see the Phoenicians coming about. Now, we see them as far back as Genesis 10:15, because Canaan's son Sidon there likely is the same person that made this city. Later on, we see that they are living in Canaan, and it seems that they are on the chopping block to get out of the land of Canaan, at least the southern portion. That doesn't seem to happen, but about this time, Israel and Tyre both seem to reach their golden ages at the same time. So in the time of David and Solomon, Phoenicia and Israel are working together and both just reaping the rewards. Both of them are becoming very wealthy. The Phoenicians were known, that's their name from Greece, by the way, they were known far and wide as master craftsmen and as traders. And we know from the Bible that they were master craftsmen. That's what we see both extra-biblically and biblically. We also know that they were traders biblically. But they were just massive traders. They went everywhere. And so it's likely that partly through their trade that Solomon gained his wealth, as well as a few other things. Now next, let me just look through my notes real quick. Yep. Next, we're going to be talking about Solomon. So we went through the time of David, and now we're getting into the true golden age of Israel, literally golden. So we have here Jerusalem underneath Solomon. So David's palace is here. Everything north of this line is what Solomon added on. And while there are some things that the artist is adding in, like some of these buildings up here, we know his house was about here, the temple was about here, and we have this watchtower here. So we have just some generalities there that are filling in the gaps. But we have a good idea of where these structures were. And probably one of the more interesting things that I came across in my studies of Solomon, dramatic pause there, was from Josephus. Now, Josephus is great for everything that he wrote that he saw. But if he didn't see it, it is a little questionable sometimes. That being said, he does quote other historians. He quotes a guy by the name of Dias from the Histories of the Phoenicians. This is a lost writing, so Josephus is the main, if not the only way, we know of this writing. But he quotes, "They say further that Solomon, when he was king of Jerusalem, sent problems to Hiram to be solved, and desired he would send others back for him to solve, and that he would not solve them, the problems proposed to him, should pay money to him that solved them. And when Hiram had agreed to the proposal, but was not able to solve the problems, he was obliged to pay a great deal of money as a penalty for the same." Kind of weird as far as how it was translated, but I'm just going to read what they said. In short, though, basically they were having problem-solving duels, which I find just very interesting. So Solomon would pose him a problem. If he couldn't solve it, then he would pay Solomon money, and vice versa. And we may have an example of this in 1 Kings 9 and 11. We see Solomon gifting Hiram 20 cities in Galilee. But Hiram is very displeased with these cities. Yet in the very next verse, we see him paying Solomon 120 talents of gold. That is about equivalent to $200 million today. So why would he pay Solomon so much money on something that he is displeased in that is a gift? It sounds like Solomon gifted him these cities trying to fix a problem, and since he couldn't fix it, he had to pay Solomon money, which I just found as interesting, is all. That's just one of the interesting things I found about this that kind of matches what we know of Solomon being a wise man. But Solomon's Jerusalem, he built up Jerusalem quite a bit. Now, we know where his temple was, but we don't have a lot of information archaeologically about it. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of destruction, rebuilding, and destruction in this area. We will talk a little bit about it when we actually talk about the temple being destroyed, but this may be what it looked like biblically. So he built massive projects. Now, where was I going? All right. Now, one thing that is interesting that we're getting more information about is that this up here is called a triglyph, the little triangle there. Now, that is stone, but it also can be made with wood. In fact, that stone is trying to imitate that wood structure. And we are finding little models, actually two in Khirbet Qiyafah, that seem to be depicting this structure, this kind of architecture. Now, previously, this kind of architecture was not known before about last centuries BC AD, as far as that goes. So about the time of Christ in Greece. We are finding some evidence to suggest that it came about a millennia earlier in Israel, about this time of David and Solomon, that it may have been part of their cultural renaissance. And it may hold the question, or hold the answer to a question in 1 Kings 7:2 through 3. 1 Kings 7:2 and 3. He built also the house of the forest of Lebanon. This is talking about Solomon's palace. The length thereof was 100 cubits, and the breadth thereof 50 cubits, and the height thereof 30 cubits. Upon 4 rows of cedar pillars, with cedar beams upon the pillars, it was covered with cedar above the beams, that lay on 45 pillars, 15 in a row. For many millennia even as far back as the Greek and Arabic translations, so the Septuagint, the first, as we know of, Hebrew to Greek translation of the Old Testament, changes these numbers. They change the 4 to a 3, or the 45 to 60, because you have 2 mentions there of pillars. Yet 45 pillars and 4 rows, 15 per row, does not equal 45. That equals 60. And so they're trying to fix the math there. But with this new understanding, you have 4 rows of pillars, beams, and then these, the word pillars there, for both the top and the bottom, are literally translated ribs, I believe. So it seems to be that they're talking about the pillars here, beams, and then bracings for the roof. 45 divided by 15 means 3. 1, 2, 3. So it could be that Solomon's house was a triglyph house. And that also means that there are some other passages of the description of the temple, as well as the second temple that was built, when it was built, that it may have had a similar style of architecture. Again, this is very new understanding. A lot of the stuff that we're going over for this last lesson in this has only come about in the last decade or two. While we have some of these findings for decades, the modern technology we have has given us the ability to get a lot more down and deep with some of this information. But we'll know more here, Lord willing, in another decade or two, so stay tuned. But Solomon's cities, this is where we're going to spend a little bit more time. In the Bible, we hear of Hazor, Gezer, and Megiddo all being built up by Solomon. And archaeologically, we see that within a small period of time, these 3 cities especially go from relatively small fortifications to huge fortified cities. All of them using the same blueprint. All of them almost virtually identical with the number of these structures. And you can see here as far as the overall shape of Israel. An interesting thing about Gezer, though, is if you recall, this is a wedding gift from Solomon's father-in-law in Pharaoh. Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter. Now, while the Bible does not tell us who this Pharaoh was, with the timeline and with the event of capturing Gezer, in 1 Kings 9, 16, and 17, it talks about how Pharaoh went and captured Gezer and burned it with fire and slain the Canaanites that dwelt in the city, then gave it to Solomon as a portion unto his daughter. And so we see archaeologically, both in Egypt as well as in Canaan, that this city was destroyed, and a guy by the name of Pharaoh Simon took credit for it. He is the 6th pharaoh of Egypt's 21st dynasty. So basically, Egypt is going into full stagnation at this moment. But he goes, he captures the city, and that's really the last we see of Egypt at this time outside of Egypt, at least in the north. Besides of Pharaoh Shishak, which we'll get into a little bit. But for a while anyway. Now, Gezer, we see level 8, as it's called, is Solomon's Gate. And we know this through carbon dating. The layer after that is Pharaoh Shishak's destruction layer. 2 layers before that, though, we see a redevelopment layer here called the ephemeral phase, where everything's being built back up because everything and stratum 10 was destroyed in a fiery destruction layer. Again, events that we see just from a few verses, all showing up archaeologically in a sequential order for the city that is said to have these events. But back to the gatehouses. There we go. These 3 gatehouses have 6 chambers throughout each side, parallel, just like the two-chamber gatehouse we saw before. These, though, are hundreds of miles apart, or over 100 miles apart. Yet they have the exact same design, dimensions, and construction date, showing that there was an overarching blueprint, design, resource, and basically a state that owned all this land. And I do want to make a note here. While it says that they have the exact same dimensions, we today are a little bit spoiled on exactness. Exact for us is within a millimeter. Exact for them is within a number of inches. So I just want you to understand that. We have far more precise technology than they did. That being said, this is incredibly exact for this time period. The dimensions are about 4.2 meters width, and width of the wall being 5.2 feet. I'll show you those gates here in a moment, so you don't have to imagine that. We have some ashlar masonry. Remember, that is key for this time period, reflective of the Phoenician influence. And here are the gates. We have the Megiddo gate, the Hazor gate there, and then that would make this the Gezer gate. I wish I could get them all from the same view, but you can see well enough how they overlap. This one probably is the best as far as its structure. You can actually go to these places and see them as far as I'm aware. But these are all near virtually identical. Yet they don't mean anything if we cannot connect it to Jerusalem, because many will try to connect these 3 gates here to a later time period, because they are all in what would be called the northern kingdom of Israel later on. So when the kingdoms divide, they are all in the northern kingdom. So you have a number of people with very little evidence trying to say that these were from the time of Omri or Ahab, some time that had a lot more stuff to do with this, resources to use for this, because they just basically deny everything as far as what the Bible says about Solomon's wealth and what we see archaeologically here in a few moments. But Jerusalem's gatehouse basically blows that out the water, because Jerusalem was never owned by anyone other than Judah until the time of the dispersion. Jerusalem has another gatehouse that is, again, nearly identical. There are a few marginal differences about the geography, so about the land underneath, and one minor thing about the Jerusalem gatehouse. What isn't great, though, is the Jerusalem gatehouse is very fragmentary. We can see 4 chambers very well. 5th and 6th chamber we just have some minor evidence for. Unfortunately, it is pretty fragmentary. It's been destroyed. But it means that these 3 cities here are connected with Jerusalem, connected with Judah. And we do have a few other gates, but these are the main 4 that we can connect biblically to being built by Solomon, because these are the 4 places biblically that Solomon built up. You can see those 3 gates there with Jerusalem having just a little extra hook there. This is a slightly different style that we see a number of other gates with, but again, we're just focusing on the overall dimensions. You can see they're virtually identical, just being off by a few inches. The part that we have here in gray is the part that is not visible archaeologically. We just have these walls, basically. But you have them on the map here, Megiddo being the most northern one, or sorry, Hazor being the most northern one. This is the Jerusalem gatehouse, what we have archaeologically and what we have drawn out. Another interesting thing is it has this tower. That is that tower I pointed out to earlier. This is a great defensive structure, not only because of how big the tower is, but because when people came in, they'd have to make a right-handed turn, a 90-degree angle, losing all momentum on their attack. So this is a great fortification. And then again, you'll see here what it may have looked like in times past. People would have come up here and they went into the city. So this is the gatehouse, this is the tower. You can see again here, comparison. But this would have been truly massive, a massive monumental scale of a building. And all of these were built with Solomon's cubit. In short, the long cubit. I was attempting a joke, sorry. But the long cubit would have been 20.6 inches, give or take. You can see here, it's called the ruler of Maya. This is found in Memphis, Egypt, from the 18th dynasty, so about the time of the Exodus. So it seems that Israel took the measurement system found in Egypt with them out. This is another piece of evidence to suggest that when Moses wrote the Torah, when he said cubit, this was the standard cubit of the time. So Noah most likely used this kind of measuring device, or at least the equivalent of that. So when he built the ark, the dimensions we have of the ark, most likely using this cubit. And this is the cubit that we see is being used on these gatehouses, as well as a number of other buildings. We know biblically that Solomon is supposed to be the one having this cubit. In 2 Chronicles 3:3, this is written at the time of Ezra, supposedly about the 5th century. Now, this has a clarification statement. So it says cubits after the ancient measure, or the first measure for the King James Version. Meaning that this was not the standard cubit. The Solomon cubit, the long cubit, was not the standard cubit of the time because we have this clarification statement there. It also means that the long cubit was the one used in the past. Again, time of Solomon. Ezekiel as well, 6th century, a cubit and a hand's breadth each. Again, clarification statement, meaning it wasn't the standard cubit. This is the long cubit and a hand's breadth. So the short cubit is just basically a hand's breadth shorter of the long cubit. So both these tell us that the previous cubit in Israel, standardized cubit, was the long cubit. The current one here in the divided kingdom phase is the short cubit. We also see this with structures in the divided kingdom phase. The Solomon inscription with Hezekiah's tunnel says it's 1,200 cubits. With the length we have today, we know that means it's the short cubit. We also know in Deuteronomy 3:11 that when it's talking about the giant Og's bed, 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man, that clarification statement means that they are using the short cubit, with the standard being the long. And so all this is pointing to that these buildings were being used or being built underneath the measurement system that the Bible says was in use at this time. Now, I'm sure plenty of you are tired of architecture, so we will talk a bit more about pottery, because why not? Prior to 2023, so before last year, there was no evidence attesting to the biblical Queen of Sheba and her connection to Jerusalem. Not that Sheba was not a country, but that it had no real connection to Jerusalem archaeologically. Now, before then, we have discovered some broken pithoi storage vessels. You can see a piece here. But for a long time, this was thought to be a Proto-Canaanite Israelite inscription, though they never really got a good translation. But it does date to the 10th century BC. And this was found in Jerusalem, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. Well, here recently, it was shown that this is an ancient South Arabian dialect. And what it means is 50 shehelet. Now, this is the ingredient found in the incense in Exodus 30:34 for the temple, for the tabernacle. That formula was only used by the tabernacle, and this is one of the ingredients for that. So what it looks like is that this was a pithoi jar capable of handling about 5 ephahs, which means the inscription is accurate. The translation of the inscription is accurate, I should say. And all this, let me go to the next slide real quick. All this shows is that Jerusalem and Sheba, you can see down there at the bottom of the peninsula here, had a connection. Because this jar, this pithoi jar, was made in Jerusalem. And when it was in Jerusalem, before it was fired, it had that carving put in it. And it is written in the Sheba dialect, meaning that people were sending stuff up here, they were repackaging it in Jerusalem and sending it off. They would come by Red Sea, they would come by land, they'd go through the country of Edom, again, a good reason for all those fortresses there. They didn't go to Jerusalem to be used and then shipped out. This is one of the ways in which Solomon could have gathered all his wealth, at least a good portion of it. We also have a number of copper mines. The Bible says Solomon possessed quantities of bronze that it became a common material not worthy of being numbered. 1 Kings 7:47. Now, bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, so you need a lot of copper to make a lot of bronze. And we see 2 major copper mines here and here in the valley of Araba. Now this is, again, where those fortresses would have been. Nelson Gluck, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right, dated these 2 vast mining operations in the north and the south to about the 10th century. And while there has been much debate over it, that dating still holds today. He's quoted as saying, "The mineral deposits of the Wadi Araba have been worked in previous ages, in fact, as early as the time of Abraham. Never, however, were they worked as intensely and in a coordinated fashion as from Solomon's time on." You can see here some of the mines. You see a vertical shaft as well as a horizontal entrance. There were hundreds of structures in just the North Valley alone, the North Complex alone. Mines, smelters, a large fortress, all to protect this valuable industrial operation. Now, this would have produced a near unlimited supply of copper. These are very rich lands here. And we can know how much they produced based upon their slag heaps. So, when they bring the copper ore out of the ground, they'll smelt it, get rid of all the stuff that's not copper, and just toss it in the ground in a pile. Well, no process is 100%. So there's going to be some copper in there, so we can see about their smelting techniques. There's going to be some trash in there, like charcoal. So we can date this by carbon dating. We can then see how much slag comes from the same time period to see how much they were producing. And we can figure out how much copper they would have produced based upon the minerals still in the land today. All that showing that they produced a lot of copper. And this all occurred about the 10th century. This is one of the new findings since the 1950s that shows that this occurred at this time period, at Solomon and David's time period. They were producing huge amounts of copper. Basically, more than what Edom or Israel could use, because remember, this is in the land of Edom underneath the control of Israel. So they would have been sending this everywhere. Another way in which Israel, Solomon, would have produced a massive amount of wealth. They would have sailed to sell it everywhere. Ocean trade, sorry, another joke. But we see that Cyprus, their main competitor, wasn't really doing much at this time period. So we have found this copper from Egypt, Lebanon, northern Israel, Greece, and perhaps as far away as Sardinia. And so we see this going all over the Mediterranean. This would have been quite a bit of copper. What is also interesting is that at this time we see in the production of copper far less copper in the slag, meaning their resources, what they are doing, was becoming more advanced. They had not only a cultural renaissance, but a technological renaissance at this time. Again, fitting what we know with Solomon in the Bible, since he is listed as doing a number of other interesting things for production. We also have a number of other things caught in the slag heaps, showing that these were not slaves working here. These were wealthy, well-funded, well-dressed, well-fed people. We see hundreds of textiles and food remnants. With some of these fabrics here, you can see the brightly colored fabrics, and even some expensive purple dyes. These were the people that were working. Their clothes would get caught in the smelter. They would then get tossed in the slag. So as they're working, pieces of their garments would be torn off, would have been caught in their work, and they would lose it. Burn a hole in their garments, but we get that, and that's wonderful. That is wonderful archaeologically. Showing that this was a rich people. These were not like Egyptian slaves that you might have. These were well-fed people. In fact, they had food from a number of places. They had figs, grapes, olives, pomegranates, wheat, and almonds. And even though the Aqaba Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba of the Red Sea was close, they got their fish from the Mediterranean Sea. They got their fish far and wide. These were well-fed people. These were rich people working here. Not just running it, but working it. And last, with the 10 minutes we have left, I want to talk a little bit about Tarshish. Now, we don't know for sure that this is biblical Tarshish, but we do have a lot of data to suggest that. So in 1 Kings 10:27, we know that silver was as common in Jerusalem as stones. And in Ezekiel 27, we see that Tarshish, I'm going to get tongue-tied on that, did business with you because of your great wealth of goods. They exchanged silver, iron, tin, and lead for your merchandise. Judah and Israel traded with you. They exchanged wheat for minnith, and confections, honey, olive oil, and balm for your wares. The ships of Tarshish serve as carriers for your wares. You are filled with heavy cargo as you sail the sea. This is a very far place from Israel. This is where Jonah fled. The Assyrians understood this to lie at the end of the world. And basically the Phoenicians, we know that this is a historical place, not only from this, but also the Phoenicians have a commemorative decoration or dedication showing that they escaped from Tarshish to Sardinia. These are two far-off places on the Iberian Peninsula. What is at least near Tarshish, if not Tarshish itself, this is located about 3,200 miles from Jerusalem, 47 miles upriver from Cadiz. And this place here is locally known, or was known, as the Hill of Solomon. This land here stretches about 90 miles in length, 20 miles in width between Seville and Lisbon. This is in Spain. And the epicenter of this is a place called Rio Tinto, the largest mine in the area. And deposits have yielded about 6 million tons of precious metals. Israel, Phoenicia, Rome, and colonial Spain all left behind their telltale signs. Over 18 million tons of slag heaps are in this area. And we have a lot of Phoenician pottery here. Now, this hill in the picture is no longer there. They tore it down. They did let archaeologists have their way with it first. But unfortunately, this was some time ago. And so the technology wasn't as great, and we may have missed a number of things. The worst thing is that fits, so it doesn't fit perfectly biblically, is that the latest buildings here are from the 700s BC. That's too far after Solomon to be Solomon. Now, this still could be a relationship with Phoenicia, and again, we have the Phoenician pottery there. So Phoenicia still may be working with Israel at this time, but this was not Solomon's Tarshish. However, just nearby, in a place called the Huelva City, there are some ancient ruins about 2,145 meters across. And these lands go back further in time. Basically, this would have been a I'm getting tongue-tied today, I'm sorry. I'm not even going to say that, sorry. You can read that there. But there's quite a bit of pots and pans, again, from Tyre, from Phoenicia. Again, another very rich land. It's just next door, probably in the capital of Tarsus. That's what the Greeks call this place. And that is closer to Solomon's time, just after with Rehoboam's time exactly. And again, archaeologically, you could be moving the time about a few decades either way. So this could be the Tarshish that Solomon went to. Or it could be we haven't found the evidence to connect it back exactly to Solomon's time, but it's very close. So it's not a perfect fit, but we're seeing a lot of evidence for a ton, literally millions of tons, of very expensive minerals and metals coming from this place, silver especially. So we have seen how David and Solomon could have gotten all their wealth, especially Solomon. We have those mines, the massive trade routes, the spices from Sheba, the copper from Edom, and silver as far away as Spain. And they probably traded through Phoenicia as well and got quite a bit of their money that way, if not the $200 million that Hiram gave him for those cities in Galilee. All this showing that Israel at this time was not just a ragtag group of tribes, as many will try to say today, as many secular archaeologists will try to say. This was a vast network of a state, a wealthy state, a powerful state, a state that was in its prime, a renaissance, a building up architecturally, culturally, scientifically, all coming into the golden era of Israel. Now, going forward, we aren't going to be able to paint a decent picture of the time period, simply because we just covered a little over 100 years in 2 lessons. I probably didn't do a very good job of giving you a full picture of what was going on. I'm not even going to be trying to do that for the period of the divided kingdom. That is going to be about 300 to 400 years worth. So it's going to be very similar to the time of the Judges. We're just going to be looking at one passage, seeing how that connects archaeologically, historically, looking at another passage, and so on. If we had half a dozen classes, maybe we could do that in greater detail. I'm not the person for that, though. So that is a lot more work than I have put into this, and a lot more work than I don't know if I'm capable of, at least archaeologically. So next time, you'll definitely need to be bringing your Bibles and checking every little thing, making notes next to verses to double check later if you don't have time. But we won't be able to get a full picture like I would like to do. Resources, you can look here at some of the archaeological resources. Most of this came from the Armstrong Institute. They have a magazine that comes out relatively frequently called Let the Stone Speak. A lot of this just came out, I'm sure I told some of you about this, just recently, and it was a wonderful issue that had all those pictures. So if you like those pictures, look into this. If you want to know more about it, the one most recent talks about some of those models they found with the triglyphs. I haven't read it myself, but I did see that on the cover, so I know they talked about it. Any questions today? Any concerns? Any burning thoughts? All right. Otherwise, that was it. Thank you.